Hi, this is Sarit Switzer, and welcome to the It Is Taught podcast, a podcast devoted to the teachings of Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi as recorded in his most famous work, the Tanya. My hope for this show is to make these teachings accessible and relatable to the average person, regardless of prior Jewish education or affiliation. The episodes follow the prescribed daily study portions and are meant to serve as practical lessons in how to live your life as your true self and develop an authentic and powerful relationship with your Creator. I have personally experienced the effects the study of this work has had on me, and I'm excited to share what I can of this knowledge with you. So please join me on this journey of learning, self-growth, and connection with your source. Hi, and welcome to the It Is Taught podcast. This is episode 93 for the 22nd of Adar Aleph in a leap year. And today is going to be one of those longer episodes. We are going to learn an entire chapter, chapter 31. So get ready, get comfortable, get ready for the journey. And honestly, I was a little intimidated approaching this episode today just because it is such a long chapter. In a regular year, it's divided up into 4 days, and each one of those 4 days could be an entire episode in its own right. Like, there's just so much here. It's a lot, but I will try to the best of my ability to give it over as best possible and try to make it accessible as I try to do. And one thing, and it's good stuff, because one thing that you may have been noticing so far about the Tanya is that even though the explicit purpose of the Tanya is really about how to get closer to God and how to serve God better and fulfill our mission on earth, it's also just very good psychological advice. So for anybody who has ever been through therapy or has a background in psychology, some of the ideas that are brought up in today's episode might be of special interest to you, and they hopefully will resonate with you really deeply, because they are, it really is all about human psychology. So I think it's really cool to kind of see this overlap sometimes when it's like you learn about certain things in psychology and see how the brain works and see how our behaviors work and everything, and then see how in Tanya it really lines up. And it's actually like when we try, and how being a religious Jew and trying to serve God and trying to get close to God, not only does it not contradict being a healthy, functional human being, but in fact, if we do it the right way, it can actually make us into a healthy, happy, functional human being. And it can really enhance our lives in that kind of way. So with that being said, the way that I'd like to go about this is I'm going to try to the best of my ability to kind of give over the entire chapter that we're going to be learning in a more like summation format at first. Then we will go into the text, and then as usual, I will try to summarize it at the end. So, but to begin, what I would like to talk about to make it again more accessible and relatable is talk about this concept in psychology called learned helplessness. You may have heard of this idea before. So the concept of learned helplessness is very sad. It's something that often people who suffer with depression suffer with, which is this idea that they've sort of like become conditioned for whatever reason in their life to believe that they are helpless and that their life is pretty helpless, that they are victims of their external circumstances, and that things are just not going to get any better, that there's like this feeling of no matter what they do, their life will never improve, and there's nothing they can do. So what this brought to mind for me is the story of Sisyphus. If anybody's familiar with he was a character in Greek mythology who was a king, and he was he did a lot of trickery, and he was such a good trickster that he actually defeated death a few times. And so then Zeus punished him for this by forcing him to roll a boulder, a very big boulder, a big rock up a hill. And every single time he would try to roll this boulder up the hill, it would fall down. And then he would roll it up and it would fall down, and roll it up and fall down. And this is where we get the term Sisyphean from, if you've ever heard that term before, which is this idea of just like doing futile labor, like working at something, and you're never really getting anywhere with it, and it's really futile. And this is known to be one of the most depressing things ever in the world, if anybody's ever experienced this. it's taught that in a certain sense, this was one of the things that was so bad about our slavery in Egypt and the time that we were put to work to build all of the pyramids and everything, is that much of what we did, what would happen is that the Jews would build up certain walls and certain cities and then immediately have it all demolished and all torn apart. So it's a very depressing thing. If anybody's ever experienced this, if you're trying to work at something and then it's like you lose all your work and then like you're writing a paper and then the entire paper gets erased from your computer or something. So imagine if like that kept happening over and over and over again. It's not pleasant, right? It's pretty depressing. So now the way this relates to the Tanya and what we're going to be learning about is that this is how the Alter Rebbe starts off, as he actually addresses something which I had brought up a few episodes ago, where it was really kind of like getting to me, the fact that like a lot of what we had been learning in the past few chapters seems really depressing. It was just like all about how the fact that get it out of your head, you are not a tzaddik, you'll never be a tzaddik, you're actually just like a hump of flesh, you're lower than an animal, really break yourself down. If you don't think that you've ever sinned, you're probably wrong. You probably have. And this is what's holding you back. And this is where your negative feelings are coming from. So it was a lot of like beating ourselves up. And this can lead to a feeling of learned helplessness, right? I mean, I think that would be a natural conclusion of it all, is like we're learning this book, and it's sort of like, if anything, you can say this is the kind of premise of the entire book, is it's a book for the Beinoni. It's a book for somebody who's an intermediate man, which by definition means somebody who struggles their entire life. It's really a lot like Sisyphus, if you think about it, and they will never become a tzaddik. Like the Alter Rebbe made it very clear in the very first page of the Tanya, you will not be a tzaddik. Never, like, don't get that out of your head. You won't be a tzaddik, and the best you can do is to strive not to be a wicked person. So, yeah, this sounds super depressing. So, what do we do with this? And this is how the Alter Rebbe starts off the chapter today. Is what happens is if you start learning all of these things and you start really becoming very introspective and contemplative and doing all the things that the Alter Rebbe is telling us to do, and you get depressed and you become sad, which is very understandable, right? And on the other hand, we know that we're supposed to serve God with joy. So how do we reconcile this? How do we deal with this inevitable depression that will come upon a person if they really do all of these steps that we've been describing? So what the Alter Rebbe teaches us, and what we'll learn, is that this isn't random, and it's not like just like this negative side effect of trying to serve God and then, oh, by the way, you'll feel a little sad and yeah, you might get a little depressed. Too bad. Sorry. No, in fact, we'll actually learn that it's sort of like this like interesting trick, that the sadness itself holds the key to our salvation. It holds the key to our entire purpose in life. So you might be like, huh? Like what? How does this make sense? So to understand this, we have to understand where sadness comes from, the origin of sadness. So sadness, and we already learned this previously, but the Alter Rebbe brings it up again here, comes from klipas noga. So just to give a little bit of a review as to what klipas noga is. So we talked about how the klipos in general are these husks that conceal godliness from the world. This is God created the world in such a way that there are certain things that reveal him in a more overt way and certain things that conceal him. And those things that conceal him, the reason why they conceal him is because they're covered up with like these like shells. And there are different types of shells. Some shells are totally opaque and totally conceal God, and there's no way for us to reveal God through those shells, because that's just how they are. So those would be things like unkosher animals or things like that are just like stuck, like the godliness within them is totally stuck, just totally trapped, and there's no way we can uncover it. But then there's this other category of husks, of klipos, which are called klipas noga. And klipas noga can be thought of as more like translucent kind of husks. And these translucent husks do have a little bit of an ability to have God shine through them, but it's up to us. This is where like human agency comes in, and we have the ability to either let these husks conceal God or have the husks reveal God. So they sort of serve as this kind of like intermediary between the good place and the bad place. So now coming back to sadness. So the interesting thing about sadness is that sadness does come from the klipos. It comes from these husks. But what klipos does it come from? It comes from klipos noga. It comes from these more translucent klipos, which means that it does have an element within it that it has some speck of holiness, which means it has a redeeming factor. So what we need to do is uncover this redeeming factor and figure out how to redeem it. So how do we do this? And so what we'll learn in this chapter, again, and we haven't gotten into the text yet, but just to get an idea of it, is we're going to channel the sadness. And that's how we do it. So how do you channel the sadness? Is by transforming it, or really forming it into bitterness, as opposed to just letting it sit in this like sad state. And the Alter Rebbe brings an analogy for this that is brought up in the cites an analogy for this that's brought up in the Gemara about how if you think about an axe, so an axe is used. What do we use an axe for? An axe is used to chop down a tree to create wood. But what's an axe made out of? An axe is also made out of wood. The handle of the axe is made out of wood. So we use the very thing that we are chopping down to chop it down. So it's a similar thing here is what the Alter Rebbe teaches us, that in order to get rid of sadness, we need to use its own methods against this. So rather than try to eradicate the sadness and like ignore it or push it away, we actually want to go into the sadness and we want to channel it and transform it into something called bitterness. Okay, so now here's a good chance to talk about what's the difference. Sadness, bitterness. On the surface, they kind of seem like the same thing, right? So the difference, there's a very core difference between these two things, is that when we talk about sadness or depression, maybe we can make those two synonymous. That falls more into this category of learned helplessness that we've been talking about. There's like an apathy about it. There's the way the Alter Rebbe explains it is it's a closing of the heart. It's like a blockage of the heart. Versus when it comes to bitterness, when somebody feels bitter as opposed to feeling just sad, the heart is very much open. The heart is very much alive and vital. It's just very anxious. It's like, it's not a pleasant kind of feeling, but there's feeling, something's going on there. And on a Kabbalistic level, this is because the bitterness does come from a holy place. It comes from the Gvuros. The Gvuros are the severity, the attributes of severity, but it is a holy attribute nevertheless. And this is in contrast to the chasadim, which is so the gvuras are on the left side, which is the side of more like restraint and severity. And chasadim, which is like more joy, comes from the side of the right, from kindness kind of thing. And as explained in Kabbalah and Chassidus, sometimes you need the severity, the gvuras, in order to beat out the sweetness and reveal and cover the sweetness. So an analogy that came to mind for me, this isn't in the Tanya, but it seemed to be a very obvious kind of analogy, is if you take a sugar cane, like if you just like took a sugar cane and ate the sugar cane, like as it grows in the ground, a lot of people don't realize that it's not very sweet. It's not like really edible, really. In order to make sugarcane into something sweet and bring out the sugar in it, it needs to go through a whole refining process and a whole breaking down and all of that stuff. Same thing with chocolate. If you just take like a cocoa bean, I mean, some people do. I like the taste of just raw cocoa beans, but in order to really make it into chocolate, it needs to be broken down. It needs to be beaten. So the same thing here is that what the Alter Rebbe teaches us is that in order to make sadness into joy, it needs to go through this stage of bitterness, which this bitterness is the process of beating into it, beating itself out, and that brings out the joy. And so this is why the Alter Rebbe says there is something positive about anger. It's like we want this, there should be like an angry kind of element to this bitterness. And this is why it's taught that and we've mentioned this previously, that a person's Yetzer Tov, like their good inclination, should really be angry, constantly angry against the Yetzer Hara, against the negative inclination. And so through this type of anger can actually bring out the joy. When we get really angry at something, it's like sort of shaking it up. That can actually make the person joyous. And so just another analogy that comes up for me is that there's actually a very interesting remedy for panic attacks that maybe not a lot of people are familiar with, you can try it out. I've had panic attacks before. I don't know if you ever have. If you haven't, good for you. May you never get a panic attack. But those of you who do suffer from them or have suffered from them, maybe next time you have one, you can try this, is you actually take a big bowl of cold, freezing, ice cold water, and you dump your head in it and then come out of it. And supposedly this can help with migraines too. I've actually never tried that myself, but I have tried, just as a side note, like eating really cold foods like an ice cube or something, and that can help with having a migraine or having a headache. But the basic idea of it is that the cold kind of like shocks your system, and shocking your system in that way, whether it's a headache or a panic attack or something like that, it actually has been shown to help with this, that it sort of shocks you and gets you out of yourself. And that shocking can be thought of as this like beating of the negativity. And when you beat that negativity, it's like you bring out the joy that's within it. So it's like, again, to bring it back to the klipas noga, that we said that's where sadness comes from. So how do we bring out the goodness within that klipas noga is by beating it down. So when you beat it down, this brings out the positive. And so then the Alter Rebbe then we'll go on and we'll explain how this. So what is this sweetness that we're bringing out? What is this joy that we experience? So once we've beaten into it, brought out use the bitterness to bring it out, what's the joy that we get? So the joy is that we come to this like revelation. And what's the revelation? The revelation is that true, I am very far from God, because that's, what we were experiencing. Whenever somebody's very sad and very depressed, the root of it is really feeling this sense of being very far away from God. And yes, that's very true. So we're not going to deny reality. However, we also acknowledge the fact that even within my low state of being so far from God, no matter who I am, no matter how far I've strayed, there is within me a part of God himself. There's a godly soul that's residing within me. And then you also come to realize that this godly soul is found in exile within you. And not only is it in exile, the further I am from God, the more I steep myself in my sadness, the more I actually bring this godly soul into exile, the more exiled my godly soul becomes. So then what this leads to is now we have a mission. Now we have something to do. So if you ever notice this for yourself, bringing it back to like more human psychology, you may have noticed this, that I've definitely noticed it in my own right? That if I'm ever in like a funk and I'm like just not in a good mood, I'm not in a good space, I'm feeling anxious, panicky, sad, whatever it is. If somebody calls me up and they're like, can you help me for a minute with something? I really need your help. Or, you see somebody who needs help or something like that. That actually puts you in a good mood because it gets you out of yourself. And now you have a mission. Now you have something to do. So somehow that really brings us out of ourselves. So, which is why often a very good remedy for people who are depressed is actually while therapy may be very good in a certain sense, but rather than just wallowing in your own sadness and all that stuff, sometimes volunteering can be a really helpful way to cure, or at least have somebody start to deal with and come out of depression. Because when you volunteer and when you actually go and try to do good things for other people, it gets you out of yourself and it gets you out of your depression. So this is the exact advice that the Alter Rebbe is giving to us here in the Tanya. However, interestingly, the person that we are volunteering for in this sense, and the thing that we are doing kindness for, is actually right within ourselves. It's within the godly soul that's inside of ourselves, and that's found in exile. So he's advising us basically to start to really feel like compassion for this godly soul that's within us, and that's in exile. And so it becomes like this mission to like rescue the princess, like sort of like in a video game. And so once we realize, oh my gosh, I have a mission, this is so exciting, this is amazing, and then you want to go and you want to do this mission with as much joy as possible, and then you go about it and you do everything in your power to actually serve God with joy, and to get as close to God as possible, whether it's about praying, whether it's about learning, whether it's about, putting all your energy into trying to get close to God. And so what happens is there's a shift, and the shift is that your mentality goes from being one of self-definition and like becoming obsessed with like where you're holding and who you are and your status in life, to one of a mission, and to where you no longer care about the fact that you're not going to be a tzaddik and you're only a Russia and you're maybe not even a Benoni or whatever. It's like that doesn't matter anymore, because what matters now is trying as hard as you can to get that princess, get that godly soul out of exile. And so then in the last section of this chapter, what the Alter Rebbe talks about is how he likens this to when we had to leave Egypt, and how when we left Egypt, it's a curious thing, because the way that it's described is that we had to run away from Egypt, and which is weird, because it's like, why did we have to run away from Egypt? This is a question that's brought up a lot in different in different sources and things like that, is that at that point, like the point that we actually left Egypt, Pharaoh was actually was begging us to leave. He had enough of the plagues. He was very happy for us to leave. And so there was no reason for us to rush. So what was the rush about? So the way that it is taught in the deeper understanding of the text is that what had happened is that we actually developed Stockholm syndrome, and we actually started to feel comfortable in Egypt. And even though there was a part of us that knew that we had to leave and it would be better for us to leave, we were very entrenched in the exile and in the Egyptian culture. So the rush wasn't so much because the Egyptians wouldn't have let us out, but the rush because perhaps we wouldn't have let ourselves out. And so this is why we had to rush out of Egypt. And so basically what this is teaching us, really, when we relate it back to the rest of the chapter and everything that we will be learning, is that we are our own worst enemy. So we are the ones that entrench this godly soul in exile. So we have to get ourselves out of this exile that the godly soul's in. But the thing is, and this is the final thing that the Alter Rebbe teaches us, is that we didn't create ourselves. So we didn't set it up in this way. We're not our own creators. God created us, and God set it up like this. God set it up that our godly soul is in exile within our body, and we have an animal soul, and we have impulses and all these things. And so then the question is, why? Why did he do that? Why put the godly soul in exile like this and make it suffer and make us suffer and have all life be about suffering and struggle and all of that? And the truth is that the reason why God did this is because it is for a purpose, and it's because the descent is for the sake of the ascent. And the lower that we are, the higher we can go. And so the fall and this fall into exile is for this specific purpose. For us, the reason why our godly soul is in exile is for us to specifically go and work and try our hardest to get it out of exile. And this process is actually one of a huge amount of self-refinement and growth, and it is really the mission and purpose of our lives. So that was a lot, I know, and that was just the intro. So we will now get into the text, and this will probably be a lot of repetition of everything I just went over. I just felt like it would be helpful to kind of give this like overview at first before getting into the tangles of the text where it might get a little bit more confusing. So it's good always to review chapters. I reviewed this chapter a few times before embarking on trying to give it over to you guys today. So now we will get into the text, and hopefully with everything that we've learned in mind, maybe the text will be a little bit more comprehensible and cohesive too. So here we go. So the Alter Rebbe begins, and he says that it may come to pass that if a person really meditates and contemplates at length about all of these things that we've been discussing, meaning that we are very flawed people and not as great as we think we are and all of that stuff, this most likely will lead to a lowering of the spirit and a broken heart, as we discussed. And this may lead to a great sadness. And if this happens, then do not be concerned, the Alter Rebbe says, because even though the sadness comes from klipas noga, as we discussed, so again, it comes from the like translucent type of klipa, but it is a klipa, and it doesn't come from holiness, so it's not coming from this like purely good place, because how do we know that it's not coming from holiness? Because about holiness, it says, Oz v'chedva bimkomo. So that is a quote from Divrei Hayamim, chapter 16, verse 27, which literally means strength and gladness are in his place. So meaning to say that in the sight of holiness, there's only gladness, only good. Like sadness does not belong on the side of holiness. It's not from there. That's not the origin of where it's coming from. And there's also this idea that the Shekhinah, the divine indwelling, doesn't dwell unless in a place of happiness. So it only dwells in a place of happiness. And so too, when we talk about halacha, that there must be a certain joy. This is explained in the Gemara in Masachet Shabbos, page 30b. You need a certain type of joy when you're studying halacha. However, there is an exception to this, and this is what the Alter Rebbe gets into here, is that if the sadness is coming from heavenly affairs, then yes, true, it is coming from Klipas Noga, but if you recall, within Klipas Noga, there was a spark of good within, and that's what made it different than the other Klipos. So it's coming from the spark of good that is in this Klipas Noga. However, it is Klipa, right? So it's not coming from Kedusha. And then in brackets, the Alter Rebbe says that this is why the Arizal taught that even if a person is worried about sins, which seems to be a holy thing to do, there are specified times that we should do this. It should be during times of vidui, of confession, and not in a regular time of prayer or learning Torah, because then you should just be in a pure state of holiness and joy. But nevertheless, there is this idea that in order to fight this Sitra Achra, this other side, we need to use its own tools against it. So even though it is coming from Klipos, or rather because it's coming from Klipa, because it's coming from Klipas Noga, we specifically need to use its own tools against it. So what does this mean? So for this, the Alter Rebbe brings two citations, both from the Gemara. The first one is, and I'm not going to attempt to read the Aramaic. I know Hebrew. I don't know Aramaic very well, but the translation is, from the forest itself comes the handle for the axe. So this is from Sanhedrin 39b. And this is what I mentioned in the beginning in the intro to this podcast today about this idea of how, if you think about it, what do we use to chop down trees in the forest? We use an axe, but how do we make an axe? We make an axe out of the handle of the axe is made from a tree. So it's like we're using the tree itself against it. And then there's another quote also from the Gemara, this time from Shabbos, page 121b, where it says that he encountered one of his own kind. So it's again this idea that like it's really sometimes in order to fight an enemy, you have to use its own tools against it. And so then the Alter Rebbe brings up this idea of that, which is something which we had brought up previously. This is from Mishlei, chapter 14, verse 23, where it says, that in every sadness, there should be a profit or an advantage. So meaning to say that, remember, we spoke about this a few episodes ago, if you want to go back and listen to it, that the idea of sadness in its own right is not good. There's nothing good about sadness on its own. However, if we are able to use sadness in such a way that there is an advantage from it, there is a way to redeem it. There is something to redeem the sadness if we use it or if we channel it properly. And so now the Alter Rebbe gets a little bit into semantics here, which is really going to clarify a lot of what's going on about how, on the one hand, it seems like sadness is bad, but on the other hand, sadness over holy things seems to be kind of good. So what's happening? So the Alter Rebbe says that in truth, this idea of a broken heart and the bitterness of the soul on being far from the light of God and it being enclosed in the Sitra Achra, in the other side, are not actually called sadness at all in the Holy Tongue. Because what is sadness? What is atzvos? That's the Hebrew word for sadness, is when the person's heart is blocked like a rock and there is no life force in their heart at all. And however, bitterness and a broken heart is something totally different. It's not that the heart is blocked. It's that rather there is a lot of life and a lot of vitality in the heart in order to cause it to become bitter like that. So feeling bitter, like that embitterment kind of feeling, is actually a sign of life. It's not like real depression is like where if you ever, God forbid, encountered somebody who was depressed or felt that way, there's a lack of feeling. It's like kind of like this apathy or just no feeling, versus a sense of bitterness. There is a lot of feeling. It's just that what is the feeling? The feeling, the Alter Rebbe says, its vitality comes from the gevuras, comes from the severities, the holy severities. So give a little bit of context. We kind of brought this up before about how there's 10 energies, spiritual energies that vitalize the entire world. And so one of these is gvura. Gvura is on the left side. It's often translated as restraint or severity or whatever, and it's a very important quality that's necessary, and it isn't necessarily a bad thing. Like we might think of like strictness or severity as a bad thing, but it's not necessarily. It can be used for a good thing. So the sense of bitterness, what the Alter Rebbe is teaching us, actually is coming from a good place. It's coming from the holy gvuras, the holy severities. Versus joy, on the other hand, comes from the chasadim. That's on the right side. This is the level of the side of kindness or giving and like overflow, expansion. Because the heart is made up of both of these. So within the heart, we have both. We have the expansive part of ourselves, and then we have the more restraining part of ourselves. And sometimes we need to arouse this aspect of the gvuras, of the holy gvuras, of the holy severities, in order to sweeten the judgments, which come from the side of the come from the animal soul and the Yetzer Hara and the evil inclination when they are, God forbid, in rule, like when they're starting to control the body, because the only way we can sweeten these judgments is in their source, in their root. So yeah, so basically, so it's like, if just to kind of like visualize that, if a person's, let's say if a person's evil, we talked about this war that's constantly going on between the animal soul and the godly soul. And so then if a person's animal soul is starting to, God forbid, like kind of rule over them, so that animal soul is coming also from a more severe place. It's coming from this more harsh kind of place, but not in a holy way. And in order to break it, it needs to be uprooted from its source. So what's the source ultimately of these of the animal soul and of this kind of severe energy is in the holy severity. So it's like we want to go into the energy of the severity and knock it into its place. So it's sort of like if you think about, let's say if you're teaching a class and there's a kid who is acting up in class. So the best thing to do is not to go up to the kid at that moment and start being nice to them and like, being kind and, oh, what is it that you want? Maybe we can talk about this and everything, even though I know that's a very popular idea nowadays, that we can kind of talk to criminals and make them feel good and listen to them and appease their demands. This is not the Torah way, and it's not really useful, and it's not something very practical. What you would do in such a situation, if a kid is acting up in class, you have to go over to them and be somewhat severe, and you need to kind of speak to them in their language and put them in their place, maybe just knock some sense into them kind of thing. And so this is kind of what we're doing here, is what we're talking about, is that in order, the purpose of these holy severities, the holy gvuras, is in order to kind of knock sense and fight against the animal impulse that we have. And this is why the Alter Rebbe says that the sages taught that a person should always have their Yetzer Tov, their good inclination. It should be angry against the negative inclination. And a person can do this at any time. This is something that anybody can do at any time, is they can arouse their good inclination against their evil inclination and make it angry and bring up this anger against it. However, the most opportune time for most people, the Alter Rebbe teaches, is when a person is feeling sad in any event. So if a person happens to be feeling sad, whether it's about worldly affairs or just for no reason at all. If a person, we have different moods. Sometimes we wake up and we're not in the best mood and we're just feeling sad for no reason. So the Alter Rebbe is teaching us, take advantage of that sadness. Don't let it go to waste. So if you are feeling sad, this is actually a very opportune time for you to transform this sadness in order to bitterness, and to feel bitter about your life and about how far you are from God, and to come into this state of doing a self-accounting, so to speak. And this is a very opportune time to fulfill this idea of having your Yetzer Tov, your good inclination, get angry about your evil inclination. And through this, the Alter Rebbe says, this actually is going to help you eradicate the sadness over your worldly affairs. So there's sort of two things going on. So the Alter Rebbe is teaching us that, first of all, if a person is feeling sad, this is an opportunity. So he's sort of flipping it on its head. He's saying that that sadness could actually have a positive element to it. We've thought about how sadness isn't really positive and it doesn't really have anything good about it. But the Ultra Rebbe is saying it could be positive because we can use it as a tool. And if a person is feeling sad, this is a very opportune and auspicious time to take that sadness and turn it into bitterness, and turn it into this opportunity for self-reflection and self-growth that isn't always available to us in a regular manner. And now the second thing the Ultra Rebbe is teaching us is not only is it just an opportune time to do this, but it actually, through doing this, through taking your sadness and transforming it into bitterness, this will actually eradicate the sadness and transform it into joy. So how is this, how can we transform sadness into joy through bitterness? What is that about? How does that happen? And so the Ultra Rebbe explains that it's because through this, through this process, we can actually bring comfort to our heart, that we can say to ourselves, it's like self-talk. We can say that, yes, this is true. I am very far from God. So this is like sadness. The root of sadness really is in feeling this sense of being very far from God and feeling lowly and disgusting and all these things that we talked about in previous chapters that were sort of seemed like a little bit of like a buzzkill. But so all of this is true. We're not taking away from that. But the thing that we have to remember is that this is just me. This is just my ego, my sense of self, which is my body and my animal soul that is within me. But I have to remember that within me, there's a part of God himself as well. So and this part of God, this actual part of God, is found in every single person, no matter how simple they are. So it's not something that only certain people are privy to or worthy of. Every single one of us has a godly soul that has a spark of actual godliness within it that is vested within us and that vitalizes us. And the only thing is that this spark of godliness in this godly soul is in a way of exile within us. And so that's on the contrary. The fact that I am so far from God and so disgusting and so lowly, this causes this godly soul to become further and further and further entrenched in galus. And so like you sort of shift the focus away from your sense of self as an animal and the sense of self as your ego and that kind of thing. And you put the focus into your godly soul, which is also residing within you. And you start to realize, oh my goodness, I have this godly soul, this part of actual godliness that's inside of me, that's living inside of me, but it's in exile. And the more I go far from God, I'm further entrenching it into exile. And so rather than have this just get you further into your depression, you focus on the godly part of yourself and you actually arouse a sense of compassion for it. And you start to feel this great sense of compassion. And then you say to yourself, okay, I'm going to do anything in my power to get this godly soul out of exile and bring it back to its father's home as it was in the beginning, before it was inside of the body, when it was encompassed in the light of God and it was totally unified with utmost unity with God. And so, and I'm going to do this. I'm going to bring it back to its true unity. And I'm going to use all of my energy and effort to really focus on doing Torah and mitzvahs and to really have myself be enclosed in these 10 aspects of the godly soul, especially when it comes to prayer. I'm going to scream out to God, and I'm going to really embody this godly soul part of myself in my body as much as I can in order to get it out of exile. And so basically what the Alter Rebbe is saying here is that it's like there's stages basically of what we're doing. Is like stage 1 that we got to was this idea of realizing who we are and realizing how much we identify with our animal self and realizing how low this animal self of us is, and realizing how far we are from God and how lowly we really are. And so that could make a person really sad. And then the Alter Rebbe taught us that rather than just like seeking further and further into our depression, what we should realize is that we have another part of ourselves. We have a godly self inside of us. We have a godly soul, and that we should realize that this life that we've been living that has taken us so far from God actually has entrenched the godly soul further and further into exile. And so what this should do is shift our focus away from our animal self and into the godly self and make us realize, wow, this godly self is suffering, and it should arouse within us this great feeling of compassion and this charge, this motivation to go and do something about it. So we really become proactive. So sort of like going back to the learned helplessness analogy that I started out with in the beginning of this podcast, one of the tools, just to bring it into kind of like, more mundane psychology, for somebody who has learned helplessness or depression, is to shift away from this concept of how they are a victim of their circumstance and that they have no control over their lives. It's that you teach the person that you actually have a lot more control over your life than you realized, and that really you can be your own locus of control. So you can take the control back. And this is basically what the Altar is saying, is that yes, it's true, you're far from God. Yes, it's true, you're a godly soul in exile. But guess what? The exciting part is you can do something about that. And once you recognize that, then you can take all of your energy and effort and put that into, now you have a mission, and you can put that into releasing your godly soul from exile. So you really are like that warrior who's out there to rescue the princess. This is you. You have become this warrior, and you now have a life mission, and you have something that you need to do. So, because often, again, people who feel depressed and things like that, a lot of it is because they feel like useless. Like they feel like they don't have a purpose in life. They're just kind of like taking up space. The Altar is teaching us you are not just taking up space. You have a purpose, and the purpose is inside of you, and you just need to refocus your energy towards fulfilling that purpose. And so, just to keep going with the text, so the Altar says that this aspect, this purpose, this focus that we have, is the aspect of doing tshuva and doing good deeds, and all these things that we do are all with the purpose of redeeming and returning this part of God to its source and root, which is the source and root of all of the worlds. It's God himself, which is really intense. And then the Altar says that this should be your work all of your days, and you should do it with great joy, because this is the joy of the soul coming out of the body, out of the lowly body. So it's like coming from this low place. We started in this very, very low place, and the godly soul is entrenched and exiled within this low place that we described. And now it's going back to its home. It's going back to its home in its Father's home, like it was before, while a person is involved in Torah and in service of God. And this is as the sages taught, that a person should constantly be involved in tshuva their whole life. And there is no greater joy than this, of coming out of exile and coming out of and being redeemed. And the Altar brings an analogy for this, as it's like a prince who is stuck in prison and isn't able to get out, and he's like around filth and he's around excrement and things like that, and then all of a sudden he's set free. Imagine the joy that this person would experience. I mean, you can kind of visualize it for anybody, any prisoner who's stuck in a prison for many years. Let's say they, God forbid, were sentenced to a certain number of years in there. Once they're set free, just imagine the joy that they'll have in returning home. So this is the same joy that the godly soul will have in returning back to its Father's home. And so even though, yes, it's true that the body stands in its lowliness and all that stuff, as we spoke about, and how the Zohar describes that it's like a serpent skin, and as we explained, the animal soul does not transform into good to become encompassed in holiness. Nevertheless, all of a sudden, you are going to see your soul in a much more valuable way, and you value your soul over your body. So it's like, again, you shift your focus away from your body and you put the focus on the soul. And then you start to feel this joy in your soul and not get caught up in the body and in the sadness of the body, and not allow the sadness of the body to mess you up, basically. And so then the Alter Rebbe says that this aspect is the aspect of leaving Egypt, of Yetziat Mitzrayim. Why? Because what do we learn about the leaving Egypt is that when we left Egypt, it says that the nation ran away. And seemingly, this is very strange. So we talked about that in the introduction. Why did they run away like this? Because if they would have told Paro that he has to let them go free forever, he would have been forced to do this because of all the plagues and everything. Like ultimately, Paro wasn't the one that was holding them back, is what the Alter is teaching us. but rather it was the evil that was in the souls of the Jews. The negativity in the souls of the Jews was still very, very strong in their left ventricle of their heart. And it didn't go away until they received the Torah. So it was like they still actually had this force that was preventing them from fully embracing godliness, even while they were in Egypt. So the Jews were their own worst enemy. It wasn't power that was holding them back. And yet their yearning and striving was to get their godly soul out of exile and away from the Sitra Achar, from the other side, which in this case was the impurity of Egypt, and to cleave to him, to cleave to God. And then the Alter Rebbe brings a few citations for this, where it says, Hashem uzi unusi b'yam tzara gomer. So this is from Yirmiyahu chapter 16, verse 19, where it says, God is my strength and my fortress, my refuge in the day of affliction. And then another citation, V'hu manos li v'gomer. And this is from the beginning of Adon Olam, which means he is my escape. So it's basically just saying that they recognize the fact that God was their refuge, and they wanted to go to God, but their animal soul was still very strong within them. So this is why the Jews had to run away from Egypt. So it wasn't so much that they were running away from Pharaoh, they were running away from their own negative self, which was the exile of Egypt. So again, it's sort of related to that Stockholm syndrome that I spoke about in the beginning, where they were so entrenched in the exile that they started to identify with the Egyptian culture and all of that. But at the same time, they had this yearning to get out, which is why they rushed out. And this is why in the future, it says that God will eradicate the spirit of impurity from the land, as is written. And here, the Alter Rebbe brings a citation, Uvemenusa lo telechon, ki holech lifnechem Hashem vegomer. And so that's from Yeshayahu chapter 52, verse 12, where it says, you will not go out in haste, nor go in flight, for God will go before you. So that's just referring to the fact that in the future, God will eradicate this spirit of impurity from the land. And so we won't have to go out in haste the way that we did in Egypt when the spirit of impurity was still pretty strong. And now the Alter Rebbe is going to give another piece of advice as to how a person can get to this aspect of having such a strong and intense tshuva that comes from the depths of their heart, and to also have this great gladness of spirit, and so that it will come with greater light and simcha and joy. So this can happen when a person instills it in their heart and in their minds to really have this feeling of compassion, to say to themselves, so what are we going to be compassionate about now, is to say to themselves, I didn't create myself. And so we come to this recognition that we didn't put ourselves here. We didn't put ourselves in this situation to begin with, but rather God created us like this. So God created us with these evil impulses, with this animal soul, with this situation, with the struggles of life and everything like that. And so why did God do this? So he did it so that he would have his light descend. So his really holy light, this light that fills all the worlds and surrounds all the worlds, and that we've talked about before, how lofty God is, that nothing is in comparison to God and nothing has any real existence apart from God. But nevertheless, God made it such that this holy light of God would be invested within this serpent skin, which is your body, and this filthy drop, this the semen from which you were born. So why did it come down into this lowly place? So this descent is for no other reason other than for it to be elevated back up to God. And so the entire purpose of your life is to have this animal soul that is inside of your body, which comes from the klipas noga that we talked about it, and all of its vestments, all of its garments, which again, we talked about our thought, speech, and action, that all of these things should be vested within the thought, speech, and action of Torah, as we spoke about before, and this will elevate it back up. And this is the entire purpose of humanity. So it's not by accident that we are in this space, basically, that we have this struggle of life. So God created us very intentionally to have these animal impulses and negative impulses and things like that. And the reason why is because it's our purpose to actually take our animal soul and all of its components and all of its vestments, that our thoughts, our speech, and our action, and to use our thought and use our speech and use our action in a holy ways. And this is a way that we can actually elevate the animal soul. And so thus the Alter Rebbe says that this will become my entire effort. This will become my entire purpose of my life. Now I have a purpose. Now I'm not just lost. I'm not just wandering around. My whole life and all of my energy is going to be just for God and God alone. And I'm going to work at trying to connect my thoughts and my speech to God, which means that I'm going to learn about his mitzvahs, his halachos, and things like that. And so too, in actually doing the mitzvahs and performing the mitzvahs, so that I'm going to really, really put all of my energy into it. And then the Alter Rebbe says that this is why in Tehillim chapter 19, verse 8, the mitzvahs are referred to as being those things which restore the soul. So it's like a restorative power of the soul. And then this is also why the Alter Rebbe says that the mitzvahs are called Pikudei Hashem Yisharim Mesamchei Lev. God's commandments are just, they gladden the heart. So then this is also from Tehillim, from the same chapter, from chapter 19, verse 9. So again, this idea that there's like a healing quality of the mitzvah. So the Alter Rebbe is basically saying that when we think about doing the mitzvahs and doing the commandments, yes, sure, we do the commandments because these are things that God commanded us to do, but we also do them because there's a healing faculty to them, that it actually will restore our heart to feeling glad. This is how we can get ourselves out of depression, and this is how we can give ourselves a purpose in life and bring our godly soul back to where it needs to be. So that's the end of the chapter. I know it was a lot. Let me try to sum it all up to the best of my ability in just like a really very succinct way, because I know the intro was a lot. But so the basic idea is what we've learned today, in really short, is that up until now, or a big portion of what we've been learning in the past few episodes, can seem really depressing. It's like sort of the Alter Rebbe is breaking us down, really tearing us apart. But as we learn in today's chapter, the purpose of that breaking us down and tearing us apart is really to build us up back up again. And the building us back up again is what he tries to do in this chapter. And the way that he does that is he says, yes, through thinking about how lowly you are, how far you are from God, how you really are just full of animal impulses, and that's how you live your life, this can make you feel very sad. And it's true that sadness comes from not a holy place. It comes from klipas noga. It comes from the klipos. However, remember, it comes from the klipas noga. So klipas noga has an element of good in it. And that little spark of element of good, that's actually where sadness comes from, which means that it is possible to redeem it. How do we redeem it? We redeem it by taking that spark of sadness and make it into a sense of bitterness. So that means that we take our apathy and we take our sense of helplessness and lack of feeling, and we actually become very bitter about it. And when we start to feel a feeling of embitterment, this actually is it is a feeling. It's not just like a blockage. We open up our heart, and it's a very strong feeling. And then when we feel this feeling of embitterment, when we feel this feeling of like a rage, and we want to do something about it. It becomes this like proactive energy. And so what do we do with this energy is we actually use it against itself. So we actually, now we have this strong energy, and we say, okay, like stop feeling sorry for yourself and start doing something about it. But we still don't know what we're supposed to do exactly. But so then the Alter Rebbe advises that we should take a moment and we should sit down and meditate and think to ourselves about the situation in a more calm, kind of relaxed manner, and say, okay, yes, it's true. My animal soul, my body is very far from God. It's very far. It's lowly. All those things we learned are true. However, here's the redeeming factor, is that I have another soul that's inside of me. And that other soul is my godly soul. And that's a part of God himself. And that soul may be quieter and it may not be as evident. And that's because it's in a way of exile. And that's why I don't identify with it as much, because it's exiled and trapped within my body. And the truth is, this whole time when I've been identifying with my animal soul, and the more I indulge my animal soul, and the more I go into my depression, that's actually entrenching the godly soul further and further into exile. And that's not good, right? And so now we realize that we actually can do something about this. We have the power, and God vested within us the power to redeem this godly soul from its exile. And so now we have a purpose, and we start to focus all of our energy on getting that godly soul out of exile. And the way that we do that is through enclothing our animal soul and our bodies in mitzvahs, in God's Torah, in all of the things that God wants us to do. And through doing that, that actually will redeem the godly soul and bring it back to its Father in heaven. And as a result, we no longer will feel sad, because again, as mentioned, sadness really comes from this feeling of helplessness, of like, there is no purpose to my life. There's nothing I can do. I don't have agency. And we're learning in today's chapter that you very much do have agency, and you very much do have a purpose. And not only that, this lowly animal soul that's within you, and this feeling of being so far from God, you didn't set yourself up like this. This is how God created you. So you start to realize that there's actually intention to your life, and everything is very purposeful. And there's a reason why God created you like this. There's a reason why God put an animal soul within you and had his holy spark of godliness come down into exile into your body. So the godly soul is in exile. There's a purpose for this exile, and the purpose is for you to redeem it. So, and then through redeeming it, it actually comes to this very high elevation. So I hope that was clear. It was a lot, I know, a full chapter that we learned today, and there was a lot there, but hopefully that was clear. If you have any questions or comments, please do leave them in the comments in YouTube. I love seeing YouTube comments. And tomorrow we will go on to another chapter, chapter 32, which is one of the most famous chapters in Tanya, all about loving your fellow Jew. So stay tuned, and I'll speak to you then. Thanks for listening to the It Is Taught podcast, hosted by Sarit Switzer. This podcast is dedicated in loving memory of my maternal grandfather, Avraham Yitzchak ben Binyamin HaKohen of blessed memory. Music by Shoshana. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to support the show, please share it with others and subscribe on YouTube, Apple iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. And make sure to leave us a 5-star review. To find out more about the It Is Taught project, including more information on my soon-to-be published book, please visit our website, itistaught.com. To catch the latest from me, follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Looking forward to speaking with you tomorrow, and until then, have a great day.